Every parent knows the routine: bath time, pajamas, and then that magical moment when you pull out a colourful storybook filled with giants, magic beans, and golden geese. But what if I told you that Jack and the Beanstalk, the story you're reading to your children, was originally designed to document one of medieval Europe's most systematic forms of economic exploitation and child endangerment? The tale we think we know about a brave boy climbing a magical beanstalk isn't a fairy tale at all. It's a sanitized version of documented historical practices involving child laborers, economic desperation, and the brutal realities of medieval class warfare. Behind Jack's heroic theft lies a documented pattern of children being sent to their deaths by desperate families, and behind the giant's castle lies the harsh reality of feudal lords who literally consumed the lives of the poor. You're about to discover that Jack wasn't a hero, was a child victim of economic exploitation. The magic beans weren't magical. They were a con game that preyed on starving families. And the giant wasn't a monster from fairy tale Shay, was a feudal lord whose wealth was built on the blood and bones of peasant children. The Brothers Grimm weren't collecting children's stories. They were preserving the evidence of systematic medieval child abuse disguised as adventure tales. Between 1315 and 1322, Europe experienced what historians call the Great Famine, 7 years of crop failures and starvation so severe that it fundamentally changed medieval society. During this period, something unthinkable became routine: families selling their children into dangerous labour contracts that had survival rates so low they were essentially death sentences. Court records from across England, France, and Germanic regions document thousands of cases where parents, facing complete starvation, would accept upfront payments from labour contractors who promised to feed and house their children in exchange for work. These contractors, known as bean men because they offered families dried legumes as partial payment, would collect children from rural villages and transport them to work sites that were often hundreds of miles away. The children rarely returned home. The magic beans in Jack's story weren't magical at all. They were the actual currency used in these transactions. During famine periods, dried beans, peas, and lentils became more valuable than gold because they represented survival. Desperate parents would literally trade their children for handfuls of legumes, believing the contractors' promises that their children would be well fed and eventually returned with wages. What actually happened to these children is documented in monastic records, court testimonies, and archaeological evidence that paints a horrifying picture of medieval child exploitation. The giants weren't mythical creatures. They were the wealthy landowners, mining operators, and construction contractors who used child labour to build their fortunes. Medieval mining operations were particularly deadly for children. Records from English coal mines, German silver mines, and French iron mines show that children as young as 6 were used to crawl through narrow tunnels, carry heavy loads, and operate dangerous equipment. Archaeological excavations of medieval mining sites have uncovered mass graves containing the remains of hundreds of children, many showing signs of crushing injuries, lung disease, and malnutrition. The giant's castle in the clouds represents the literal truth of how these operations appeared to rural families. The wealthy landowners lived in magnificent castles on hilltops, visible for miles around, while their wealth was extracted from underground mines and quarries, worked by children who disappeared into the earth and never returned. The golden goose element of Jack's story reflects the actual economic reality of child labour. Each child represented a renewable source of wealth for the contractors they could be worked until they died, then replaced with new children purchased from desperate families. The golden eggs weren't magical treasure. They were the daily profits extracted from child workers who generated wealth they would never see. The historical figures who inspired Jack's magic bean cellar weren't mysterious magicians. They were documented child traffickers who operated across medieval Europe with feudal law protection. Court records from the 14th through 16th centuries identify these men by various regional names: bean merchants in England, kidney dealers in Germanic regions, and pulse traders in France. These traffickers developed sophisticated systems for identifying vulnerable families. They would arrive in villages during the worst periods of famine, carrying carts filled with dried beans, lentils, and peas foods that represented the difference between life and death for starving families. The magic promised by the beans was survival itself. One particularly well-documented case comes from 1347 England, where a trafficker named Robert Labina was arrested after a surviving child escaped and testified before a royal court. The child, a 10-year-old boy named Thomas, described how Labina had visited his village during a severe famine, promising his parents that Thomas would be trained as a scribe in a monastery and return with enough money to buy land. Instead, Thomas was sold to operators of limestone quarries, where children were used to climb dangerous rock faces and clear unstable debris. He testified that he witnessed dozens of children die from falls, cave-ins, and exposure. The monastery was actually a labor camp where children were housed in underground chambers and fed just enough gruel to keep them working. The bean men understood that their business model depended on maintaining the fiction that children were being helped rather than exploited. They would occasionally arrange for one child in 50 to return home with a small amount of money, creating just enough success stories to keep the system functioning. Modern historians have identified at least 40 documented child trafficking networks operating across medieval Europe between 1300 and 1600. Conservative estimates suggest that these networks trafficked over 100 children during this period, with mortality rates exceeding 90% for children sold into mining and construction operations. The giant's castle in the clouds wasn't a magical real myth, was a documented network of feudal work sites that operated as systematic death camps for child labourers across medieval Europe. These facilities were typically located in remote, elevated positions that made them visible from great distance, exactly like the giant's castle that Jack could see from the ground. The most extensively documented site is the Harz mountain complex in Germanic territories, where silver mining operations employed an estimated 30 child workers between 1,320 and 1,450. Excavations conducted in the 1980s uncovered a vast underground network of tunnels, dormitories, and workshops that precisely matched descriptions found in medieval court records describing the giant's underground kingdom. The children housed in these facilities were kept in conditions that can only be described as systematic torture. Archaeological evidence shows that child workers were housed in underground chambers with no natural light, minimal ventilation, and insufficient space for normal human movement. Skeletal remains found at these sites show evidence of severe malnutrition, bone deformities from heavy labour, and respiratory diseases caused by toxic dust and fumes. What makes these sites particularly horrifying is the evidence of deliberate psychological control systems designed to prevent rebellion or escape attempts. Court testimony from the few survivors describes how new children were deliberately disoriented during their first weeks at these sites. They were moved between different underground chambers at random intervals, fed irregular meals, and kept in darkness for extended periods to destroy their sense of time and direction. The giant himself represents the feudal lords who owned and operated these sites. These men were literally giants in terms of their economic and political power, controlling vast territories and possessing wealth that seemed impossible to peasant families. Court records describe lords like Heinrich von Stauffen, who operated child labour sites across 3 separate principalities and was known to consume elaborate feasts while his child workers were fed starvation rations. The most disturbing discovery from these excavation sites is evidence of systematic murder when child workers became too sick or injured to continue producing value. Mass graves contain the remains of children, showing signs of deliberate killing rather than death from accidents or disease. Jack's heroic theft of the giant's treasures wasn't a fairy tale triumph of good over evil. It was based on documented cases of child survivors stealing resources necessary for their survival from the very labor operations that had enslaved them. Historical records from medieval courts reveal that what fairy tales present as magical adventure was actually desperate acts of survival by traumatized children who had witnessed systematic murder and exploitation. The golden eggs that Jack steals represent actual valuable resources that child workers were forced to produce but never allowed to keep. Court testimony from the few children who escaped these operations reveals that theft wasn't heroic rebellion. It was a calculated survival strategy taught by older children to newcomers. One of the most detailed accounts comes from 1389 France, where a 13-year-old survivor named Guillaume testified before a royal court about his escape from a silver mining operation. Guillaume described how he and 3 other children spent 4 months carefully stealing small pieces of silver and food supplies while planning their escape. His testimony reveals the psychological trauma that survivors carried for the rest of their lives: nightmares about being recaptured, chronic anxiety around authority figures, and an inability to trust adults who offered help. The magic harp that Jack steals represents something even more sinister than material theft. Court records reveal that many child labour operations used music and entertainment as psychological control mechanisms. Children were forced to sing, play instruments, or perform during the limited rest periods allowed by their captors. When children escaped these operations, they often took musical instruments with them not as valuable treasures, but as psychological comfort objects that helped them maintain sanity during their escape journeys. Archaeological excavations have uncovered small musical instruments hidden in escape routes and abandoned campsites. Historical evidence suggests that very few children who were sold to these operations ever successfully escaped and returned home. Conservative estimates based on court records suggest that fewer than 5% of trafficked children survived to testify about their experiences, meaning that Jack's story represents an extraordinarily rare outcome rather than a typical heroic adventure. The true story of Jack and the Beanstalk isn't a fairy tale about magic and adventure. It's a historical document that preserves evidence of one of medieval Europe's most systematic forms of child exploitation. Every element of Jack's story corresponds to documented historical practices. The magic beans were the currency used to purchase children from starving families. The giant's castle represents the remote work sites where children were enslaved and murdered. And Jack's heroic theft was actually desperate survival strategy, used by the few children who managed to escape these operations alive. The Brothers Grimm weren't collecting children's entertainment. They were preserving the traumatic memories of communities that had survived centuries of systematic child abuse. The transformation of these memories into fairy tales allowed later generations to acknowledge these historical practices while avoiding the moral responsibility of confronting their full scope and brutality. Modern parents reading Jack and the Beanstalk to their children aren't sharing a harmless fantasy. They're perpetuating a sanitized version of historical trauma that involved the systematic murder of thousands of medieval children. The story's persistence reveals how effectively fairy tales can function as vehicles for collective denial about the darkest aspects of human history. The real tragedy isn't that Jack climbed a magical beanstalk, it's that so many real children climbed their own beanstalks toward promises of food and opportunity, only to find systematic exploitation and death waiting for them at the top. Their stories deserve to be remembered as historical truth, rather than dismissed as childhood fantasy. Perhaps it's time to stop reading Jack and the Beanstalk as a magical adventure and start reading it as what it actually is. A memorial to thousands of medieval child victims whose suffering was transformed into entertainment to help their communities forget what they had allowed to happen. The magic beans were never magical. The giant was never mythical. And Jack was never a hero. Was one of the very few children who survived to tell the truth about medieval Europe's most horrific form of systematic child abuse.